Okay, so let's be more specific on policy for a second. NATO is the, shall we say, banner or the symbol of what we consider with Trump vis-a-vis Ukraine, right? What would Trump do? And there was an interesting piece in Politico, I'll mention it in the description, that came out at the time of recording, like 24 hours ago, but it's talking about the plan for NATO is emerging. And from what we understand, they envisage a, quote, radical reorientation, which you could summarize essentially as Washington, as the US taking more of a backseat to Europe, and ultimately this cutting of a deal. No one, I think, well, not that I certainly believe anything much Trump says, but this idea that there'll be a peace plan and established by the end of 24 when he was still president-elect is ridiculous. But he does believe he can reach some kind of peace agreement, right? And force the Ukrainians to capitulate in giving up the existing territory that Russia controls. What's your take on Donald Trump sort of trying to make NATO, not leaving NATO, but severely gutting it or severely reducing funding to NATO? How do you feel about that? And what and let's say it would happen. Entertain that for a second. What do you think it would do?
If you're an isolationist, if you're an American isolationist, you're thinking to yourself, we're not going to have a war on the North American continent. The United States isn't going to be invaded by Mexico or Canada. So why are we so involved in European affairs? So it's not necessarily a bad thing if militarily Europe does more to protect Europe, because with the Mediterranean and the North African coast, the Middle East, Russia collapsing, Europe's security is going to be precarious for decades to come. It's not going to improve the security situation surrounding Europe. So if you just say, I'm an isolationist, I'm American, why do I care? Why is my tax money going towards this? It's a very simple, compelling argument, but the converse of that is the EU is the United States' largest trading partner. We have over 1 million American citizens living and working in the European Union and the UK. So yes, there's an obvious argument that Europe's interests are deeply tied to America's interests. There is no peace and prosperity here in the United States without peace and prosperity in Europe. So there's the two arguments. People are going to pick whatever one they want to believe. But yes, Europe has to do more, and Europe is doing more. And I think this is a good thing, either way.
No, I'm glad you do acknowledge the European inertia, shall we call it. I am very frustrated with certain countries that don't carry their weight, and not something that this is an endorsement of Trump world, but there is a point that if you are going to expect to have those security assurances, you step up in your own, what you can relative to your size of economy, population, and so on. But where does that leave us? What does that say about the state of the United States, but the broader West? That I think that was the most broad sentiment, which was that because of how badly Biden performed in the debate, it overlooked the fact that Trump was not it was Trump, right? And the copious amounts of lies that he filtered out. But the main takeaway being that everyone was like, this is absolutely, this is the best the United States of America has to offer at the moment. Where do we go from here?
Even for people who support Ukraine and support democracy, I don't know anybody that's too enthusiastic about the United States and our modern history. The post-Cold War decisions that the United States has made, it's all been pretty nearsighted or just outright evil. I was 19 in March of 2003 when the United States invaded Iraq. George Bush and Dick Cheney are war criminals. They should be in prison right now. They lied about WMD. And it was a war of convenience. They thought going into Iraq would be easy. A special limited military operation. There's that famous clip of Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, saying, will this war take 3 days? Will it take 3 weeks? I doubt it'll take 3 months, or something ridiculous like that. And the United States stayed there for 15 years. And I do think big picture 2003 was a pivotal moment, because when the United States invaded Iraq in violation of the UN, and I want to make this point that China and Russia were not vetoing a Security Council resolution for the United States to invade Iraq. It was France. France was the one who was vetoing this resolution that George Bush wanted. But as soon as the United States said F you to the UN and went into Iraq, well, that kicked off a lot of things. Iran says we're next. We need to militarize. We need to get as much military capability as we can, because The United States says we're next. North Korea was added to the axis of evil in George Bush's State of the Union address. So this was 2003, and by 2005, North Korea had a nuclear weapon because they thought they were next. Russia, Vladimir Putin, I do think in the early days, Putin flirted with the idea of Russia being a liberal democracy. He then saw what Bush did in Iraq and said, oh no, I guess history hasn't changed. We're still talking about global power and, great nation, great man history. Where if you have the might, you can just do whatever you want.
Might is
and
right.
I think that set Putin and the Russians on a completely different path than they would have if the United States hadn't invaded Iraq. And what Putin is doing, I've made this argument, but Putin doesn't understand why the United States cares. If the United States didn't like the government of Mexico and wanted to invade Mexico, topple their government, and replace them with a pro-American government, Russia would be fine with it. Russia wouldn't say a damn thing because they expect the opposite in return. If Russia wants to invade their neighbor, topple the government, and replace them with a pro-Russian government, that's their right as a superpower, and the United States should stay out of it. China feels the same way. So the United States is guilty of a serious crime in their history, which has undermined our respect and our authority and our ability to talk about democracy and what's right and what's wrong in this world. So as an American, I want to state that fact. That's entirely our fault, and it's going to take a generation to make up for this, for what George Bush and the Republicans did.
I appreciate that, level of sort of introspection and humility.